Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, Ronald Shafer, author of The Carnival Campaign.
Ronald Shafer, author of The Carnival Campaign, How the Rollicking 1840 Campaign of Tippecanoe and Tyler II Changed Presidential Elections Forever. Can you explain where we're sitting right now?
We're sitting here in the Zion Lutheran Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and what's exciting is that this is where Harrison was nominated. Right here where we're sitting, the delegates were here. The church was pretty new because it had burned down a couple years before, and they rebuilt it. And the Whig Party held their first convention right here. They picked this place because a lot of the delegates were from Washington, D.C., and Harrisburg had just opened a brand new train station, so there was train connection between the two cities, although at least one delegate for Harrison rode his horse from Ohio, about 400 miles. So he probably was a little tired when he got here. But this is exactly where it all began in December of 1839.
So you said the Whig Party. What was the Whig Party?
The Whig Party was formed as a response to President Andrew Jackson. The Whigs is when the revolution started, the revolutionary people called themselves Whigs against King George. And so they adopted that name because they were against King Andrew. And they were a real wild bunch. They were like farmers, but they were bankers. So they really didn't agree on much, except they didn't like Andrew Jackson.
Were they regional?
They were across the country. And it just depended. There were bankers from New York and there were farmers from the West. Harrison was from Ohio, although he was born in Virginia, but he lived most of his life at North Bend near Cincinnati. The other major candidate was Henry Clay, who was the great senator from Kentucky. And the third candidate was General Winfield Scott. He was known as Old Fuss and Feathers.
What did it take to be a candidate then? I mean, what did it mean?
Well, the most important thing was to pretend you weren't running for president. It was considered to be very unseemly to be campaign for yourself. Presidential candidates didn't campaign. It was never done before. So Harrison wasn't here. Clay wasn't here. Scott wasn't here. They were far away, and there was no television. There was no telegraph, so they had no idea what was going on here. And they had people here on their behalf, but they didn't know what was going on, and Harrison really didn't find out till 2 weeks later.
2 weeks later?
2 weeks. It took them 5 votes here, because when they came in, Clay was the favorite. He was the famous statesman. He was the guy who that year had said, "I'd rather be right than be president." He really didn't mean that. He'd rather be president than just about anything, and he figured he was going to win. He was waiting back in Washington, D.C., and he was ahead on the first couple ballots, but he didn't have enough to win the nomination. So then started the backdoor finagling. They would go around the bars and the smoke-filled rooms, and one of the big backers of Harrison was Thaddeus Stevens, the big Pennsylvania politician. I mean, if you saw the movie Lincoln, he was the guy that Tommy Lee Jones played that helped Lincoln get the amendment abolishing slavery. So he was the big Harrison guy because he thought he had been promised a cabinet post in the Harrison administration. But so this went on, and Harrison moved up. The next couple, he was just behind Clay, but he didn't have enough votes yet because Scott was still getting enough to kind of block them. So Stevens had this trick up his sleeve. He had a letter from Scott supporting the abolitionists, which was considered very, very wild and liberal at that time.
Was it a real letter or a fake letter?
It was an actual letter that he had written to a senator, and somehow Stevens got a hold of it. So he went over to the Virginia delegation, a very pro-slavery delegation. And they were backing Clay, but they figured, well, it looks like Clay's not going to make it, so maybe we'll back Scott. So he goes over there with this letter from Scott, and he just casually drops it on the ground, you know. And of course, it is immediately found by the delegates, and they're alarmed that Scott is supporting the abolitionists, so they go to Harrison, and that starts a stampede for Harrison. And late that night, Harrison wins the nomination, and he is going to be the nominee for the Whigs in 1840.
Now, if you were sitting in this room in December, you said 1839, while the convention was going on,
Right.
what would you have seen?
You would have seen all men, because all the delegates were men, because only men could vote, of course, in those days. They were from 22 of the 26 states at the time. They would be pretty dressed up. You know, they would have big high collars with ties. They would have long sideburns, and they would basically be very formal here, but most of the action, as we said, went on behind the scenes in the bars and the hotel rooms. So at night, there was a lot of conversation going on swapping votes and so forth, until finally Harrison got the nomination.
Were there a lot of speeches like we see in conventions now, speech after speech?
You didn't see too many speeches until it was over, basically. Of course, the nominee didn't give an acceptance speech because he wasn't here. So he had his campaign manager, which was a judge who had known him for 40 years, give a speech afterwards accepting the nomination. And he seemed to spend most of his time, you got to remember that Harrison was 67 years old. And he was the oldest man at that time ever to run for president, and the oldest until Ronald Reagan. And so his friend basically seemed, his purpose was to convince people that Harrison was still sound of mind, even though he was 67 years old. So much of his speech was saying, oh yes, he still has a great mind, just as he was as a young man. And the main concern was that whether this old man could really run for president. But there was still a lot of concern about Clay, because they needed the votes of the Clay people to win the election. So they looked for a Clay supporter as a vice presidential candidate. Nobody wanted the job because the vice president had nothing to do. And finally, John Tyler of Virginia said he would take it, sort of drew the short straw. He had been a Democrat till about 2 or 3 months before, but then he quit the party because he didn't like Andrew Jackson. So he accepted the nomination. Harrison had no idea who his running mate was going to be, although, as it turns out, Tyler grew up right down the road from him in Virginia.
I learned from your book that they were cousins.
They were cousins, actually. They weren't boyhood friends because Tyler was only about 50 years old, so Harrison was older. But the families intermingled all the time. The fathers actually ran against each other in campaigns, so the families knew each other very well. So Tyler is his running mate, and as I said, he didn't find out about this. The first guy to find out about it was Clay, because he was in Washington. And the day after the convention, first I should explain, at the convention, after it was all over, Clay had written a letter saying, if I don't get the nomination, read this letter. So the letter was, if I don't get it, support whoever it is, because we have to be united. And everybody said, oh, what a great man. And they all went home united. Well, Clay is waiting in Washington, and he starts drinking at a bar. And then he goes across the street to his boarding house, and he sits and waits. Pretty soon his friends come in from the train station. They had just met some people who had gotten back, and they said, you didn't get it. So Harrison, the magnanimous Harrison, jumps up, starts running around the room, shouting and yelling and saying, my friends aren't worth a shot it would take to kill them. I'm the most unhappy man in the world.
Oh, Clay said that?
Yeah. And he was beside himself because he did not get the nomination. Eventually he came around because Harrison, when he finally got the word, said he would only run for one term. So Clay knew that if he supported Harrison and he won, he would probably get nominated the next time around.
Now, a little bit about William Henry Harrison. Most of people know just that he was called Tippecanoe.
They know two things. He was called Tippecanoe and that he died when he became president. But he had been the governor of Indiana. When he was a young man, about 18 years old, his father died. His father was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Harrison.
As you say, if I could read this for a second, you say, Billy Harrison, William Henry Harrison, grew up listening to political conversations by visitors who included such Virginia movers and shakers as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and James Madison.
Exactly. Those are all his dad's buddies. So his father dies. He didn't inherit the house because he was the youngest. He got a little property, so he needed to find a job. So on his resume, the people who he went to were some of the founding fathers. And the first one was President George Washington, who made him an officer at the age of 18 in the Army, and he went to Ohio to fight Indians, which is what he wanted to do. And he went to Cincinnati, which was like 7 or 8 buildings at the time, and joined the army of Mad Anthony Wayne. He got married there. And then he was looking for a higher paying job, and another old friend, President John Adams now, appoints him as the governor of the Indiana Territory, which is a big job. Indiana Territory was not just Indiana, it went all the way out to towards Louisiana, Minnesota, and everything. And then when Adams is defeated for president, the new president is Thomas Jefferson. Well, he's another old family friend. So he reappoints Harrison to be the governor, and Harrison builds this huge house in Indiana for the governor's mansion. He has sold some property, he has lots of money, and he has lots of kids too because he's raising kids. So he runs into problems. He's mainly buying property from the Indians for the United States at Jefferson's request. He runs into this guy who doesn't believe in selling Indian property, a guy named Tecumseh, the great Indian chief. And Tecumseh and his brother start a little town down near Lafayette, Indiana, where they bring in other tribes and they start causing a little trouble. So Harrison decides he's going to take care of that. So he gets some troops up and he goes down and they have the Battle of Tippecanoe at the Tippecanoe River. And after that battle is won, he becomes known as Old Tippecanoe. And from then on, the hero of Tippecanoe. And then...
Did he show particular bravery or innovation or anything at the Battle of Tippecanoe?
Yes, he did. The battle, he lost a lot of men, and some people consider it was more of a loss than a win, but he did wipe out the village. But in battle, he had his horse nearly shot out from under him, and he rallied his troops. There was a rumor that he had been killed. And then he shows up and gets his troops going again, and they give him 3 cheers. And so overall, yeah, he was known to be very cool in battle. So cool that when the War of 1812 broke out, they needed a general to lead the army, and the president now was James Madison, another old friend of his father. So Madison appoints him head of the army in 1812, and he wins the Battle of the Thames near Canada, in which the English had the Native Americans helping them, including Tecumseh. And Tecumseh was killed in this battle. And that victory there pretty much ended the threat from Canada in the War of 1812. And once again, Harrison was a big hero as the hero of the Thames, although he quit right after that because his boss wanted to send him some little outpost where he didn't have anything to do because they had personal problems between them. But yeah, in battle, he's considered not one of our great generals of all time, but a brave man, and he served honorably according to all the people who served under him.
And he ran for president 4 years prior to this election.
He did. He ran in 1836. He had long since, he had a couple stints in Congress, but he had long since retired, in effect, to North Bend, his farm there. And in 1836, the Whigs decided the strategy was to not have one presidential candidate, but to have one for every region, for 4 different regions, in the hopes that together these candidates would get enough vote for the Whig Party to take over. I don't know who they would have made the president, but anyway, the whole idea was to defeat, at this time Martin Van Buren was running. He was the protege of Andrew Jackson. But it didn't work. Van Buren won the election, and so this time they decided to go with only one candidate.
You say in here that William Henry Harrison didn't bother saying anything about issues, claiming that because of his long public service, everybody already knew his views, which they didn't.
Exactly. He had, as I said, he had served in Congress soon after after the war ended. He was still famous, so he served in the House and eventually got himself a spot in the Senate. But as his fame waned, he couldn't win election anymore, so he went back to his farm. But anyway, during these times, he was on the record for several things, and his view was that if you want to know what I believe, all you got to do is go back and look at the record. And he said, what intelligent man could ask for anything more than that? So he didn't feel a need to really pin down his views on any kind of issue, and he pretty much didn't throughout the campaign.
Now, so he got the nomination, and he was running against incumbent Martin Van Buren. What should we know about Martin Van Buren?
Well, Martin Van Buren, as I said, was a protege of Jackson, but he was totally different. Jackson, of course, was this vibrant guy who got mad all the time and fought in duels. Van Buren was the first professional politician to become president. He was from Old Kinderhook, New York, and he was very calculating, and he would always figure out who was on the right side and make sure he was on that side. You know, it was Davy Crockett, the great frontiersman, was a congressman, and he wrote a book about Van Buren that was very anti-Van Buren. He said he's the only man who could laugh and frown at the same time.
You say in your book that the Whigs claimed that Van Buren doused his sideburns with expensive imported French cologne. They called him Sweet Sandy Whiskers and said he was no friend of the common man.
Exactly. Van Buren grew up very poor, in a very poor family. But he went to work for an attorney who said, well, you know, if you're going to succeed, you're going to have to dress better. So he did it all the way, and he was known as a real dandy as a dresser. Again, Davy Crockett had some remark about he wears a corset just like the women do. And the only reason you couldn't tell he wasn't a woman, he had these long sideburns that went down the side of his head. And so, yeah, he was known as a very good dresser. He had a big coach that he was driven around in Washington. He had fancy parties at the White House. What happened to him, his problem was there was the Panic of 1837, which was a huge depression. It was the worst depression the U.S. had been in until the 1929 depression. So everybody was out of work. And at that time, the Democratic Party was the party that believed in no government help, that everybody should be on their own, and if you can't get a job, that's your fault. And where the Whigs came on and said the government should provide some help. So they were kind of the opposite of what the modern parties are.
Yeah, well, you have the Democratic platform in here, and it says things like the federal government has limited powers, the Constitution does not give the federal government the power to initiate and carry on internal improvements, should raise no more money than is required to defray the necessary expenses. So it does not sound like the Democratic Party today.
No, they were pretty much the opposite of what they are today. And the Democratic Party at that time was basically trying to be in the image of Thomas Jefferson, they believed, of no government at all. And at that time, the federal help, the Whigs mainly, when they talked about federal help, they talked about like building roads between states and so forth. But the Democrats said, no, the states, you're on your own, no help from the federal government. But this didn't go over well when everybody's out of work, and they're looking to the government for some kind of help. And Van Buren says, well, if you did as I do and work hard, there wouldn't be any panic. So that didn't help him in the election of 1840.
Now you say also here that one of the raps against Martin Van Buren was he spent money to fix up the White House.
Yes, that was, you remember that during the War of 1812, the British burned the White House down. So they had to be fixed up, and they were still fixing it up all these years later. So he sent as all presidents did, he sent a proposal up to Congress for appropriations to do some fix-ups. Well, a Whig congressman took this and he went to the floor of the House, and for the next 2 days, he talked about the regal splendor of the White House, and he went through the White House and listed all the things that the Van Buren supposedly had added to the White House: new wallpaper, new chairs, new fancy rugs. And he says, meanwhile, people are starving, and here is Van Buren making his house a palace. In reality, he really didn't spend any more than any other president, but it was a huge issue. And of course, the Whigs copied this speech and they sent it all over the country as an election pamphlet.
Now, your chapter 2 starts with a gentleman, Thomas Elder, the city's leading banker, meeting with a newspaper editor in a building in Harrisburg, the John Harris Simon Cameron Mansion, and you visited that this morning. What is significant about that?
I did.
building?
It was really exciting to feel, because I know exactly what happened there, as I write in the book. Right after the Democratic convention, as I mentioned, Harrison was the oldest man, 67 years old. A newspaper in Baltimore, an opposition newspaper, wrote this article saying, well, Harrison is so old, if you just gave him some hard cider and a pension, he'd be willing to just go sit in his log cabin for the rest of his days and sit in front of the fireplace. So this was a big slur against Harrison, and it just totally upset the plans for the Whigs, because they planned to make him like the Washington of the West, the general on the white horse leading his troops into battle and so forth. And here now the image is this senile old, they call him a granny, sitting in his log cabin. Oh, what are we going to do? And so this Thomas Elder, who lived in this mansion, the mansion was built by John Harris Jr., the founder of Harrisburg, named it after his father. And Thomas Elder was a banker. He was the head of the John Harris's bank, and he had bought the house from one of Harris's sons. And he also was a leading strategist for the Whigs. So he invites the young newspaper editor of the Harrisburg newspaper over to his house to decide what we're going to do about this problem. And in those days, newspaper editors were actually part of the parties, either the Whigs or the Democrats. They were not objective at all. They were very partisan. So he goes over there and knocks on the door. I was at that door this morning. He knocks on this door, this big mansion overlooking the river. It's just beautiful. And he brings him down this long hallway, and there's some rooms alongside. We're not sure which room they went into, but we figure maybe the drawing room, because it looks like a good place to drink. And he opens this bottle of expensive wine, and they said, we've got this problem about the log cabin thing. And so finally Thomas Elder says, why don't we just use it, take it, build a log cabin or something, because a log cabin is the symbol of the common people. And there had been a lot of adverse reaction from people saying the Democrats were attacking a symbol of America. The log cabin and the hard cider was the drink of the common man. So he said, well, instead of doing that, why don't we use it? And at that time, the voter rolls had expanded to include a lot of people. It used to be you had to own property or something, but no more. So suddenly there were a lot of new voters there, and they were the common man. So this newspaper editor pulls out a pad of paper and a pencil, and he starts drawing a log cabin, a little one-room log cabin. He's got a barrel of cider sitting outside. He got some raccoons running across the top. And the guy says, yeah, that might work. So he goes home, and the newspaper editor, he gets a professional drawing done. Actually, they had things back in those days called transparencies, which was a four-sided thing of pictures, and they put candles inside to light them. And they had a convention here in Harrisburg in late January to re-nominate Harrison and Tyler. So during that meeting, this guy comes out carrying this transparency with this big picture of a log cabin and the American flag and some other things on there, and the crowd goes nuts. They love it. And the speaker who was speaking when this came out just starts talking about, oh, Harrison, he's just one of the people. He's a common man, lives in a log cabin. And in modern terms, this image went viral. Within a month, the log cabin image was across the country. Everybody knew it. So the next step was to adapt it to the campaign. And Thomas Elder, again, was the key man in this thing. He said, I'm trying to think of the exact words, but he said, passion and prejudice properly aroused and directed, would do as well as, principle and issues in this campaign. So they decided to forget issues, and they went for the passion and to the anger of the voters who were angry because they were out of work. So they created what I would call, the reason I did this book was because it was the first modern campaign. First grassroots, they went to the people, went down to the people, to the grassroots. They had started with big rallies and parades starting in Columbus, Ohio, the very next month in February. And they had 30,000 people go into Columbus, Ohio, and they had this huge parade. And the main feature was these log cabins on wheels, which became the staple of all these rallies across the country.
How close to reality was the image of William Henry Harrison in the log cabin and hard cider?
Not at all. It wasn't even close. Harrison, at this point, actually lived in a mansion in Ohio, and he didn't drink hard cider. His son had died as an alcoholic, and while he wasn't a teetotaler, when he drank some very fine wines and so forth. And Harrison, you got to remember, he had no idea what these two guys were doing. So he had nothing to do with his own log cabin and hard cider image. But he didn't refute it, and he certainly kept it going throughout the entire campaign. But it was a total fraud, and some people might have known it, but it was one of these elections where the facts didn't matter that much. People were just angry, and they wanted change.
I have to jump back a little bit to something that you wrote in your book, because I have to read this sentence. President Van Buren had already defeated Harrison in 1836. Now Harrison was back for a second try, quote, like a cat which you thought you had killed yesterday, looking in at your window with a bloody head to scare you and wake you in the morning, wrote newspaper publisher William Cullen Bryant.
I love that quote. Yeah, when I saw that quote, I got to find a way to get this into the book.
Was it fun reading the old newspaper
Oh,
accounts?
it was. It was because they were just shameless. They would just say anything and make up things. There was only, fortunately for me and probably for the voters, there was only one newspaper that was really balanced. It was something called the Niles Register out of Baltimore, and they basically reprinted articles from both sides, so that you could get a really good feel of what both sides were saying on it. But for the most part, no. The articles in the newspaper were just wonderful from my point of view, but just totally shameful.
And then you say also in the book, you write about Horace Greeley as a newspaperman. What was he all about?
Horace Greeley, at that time, had just started a newspaper in New York called The New Yorker, no connection to the current magazine. And the Whig Party boss in New York and nationally was a guy named Thurlow Weed. He wanted to run his friend Henry Seward for governor of New York. So he said, it'd be good to have a newspaper that just promoted him. So he heard about this guy, Horace Greeley, up in New York, so he went up to meet him, and he met this tall, gangly, kind of strange guy and signed him up to also do this newspaper, which Greeley called the Jeffersonian. And Seward won the election. So when Harrison was nominated, they decided, well, let's do the same thing with a newspaper. And Greeley agreed to do it, and he said, let's call it the Log Cabin, since that's what the campaign now is all about, since that's, of course, is where Harrison lives. So he created a newspaper, an 8-page newspaper that came out every week, starting in May of 1840. And it was a wonderful newspaper, actually. Of course, it was filled with propaganda about Harrison and pictures of Harrison, but not as he was then at 67. They showed him when he's like in his 40s or something like that. So looked like a pretty young man, vibrant young man. But he also had poems, and then he started songs in the paper, and it was a huge success. They were selling 80,000 copies a week, which was unbelievable at that time. And it was really a fun read to read, and the Democrats started their own newspapers, but they weren't quite up to that standard. It was a very, very heavy-handed. So Greeley had a lot to do with Harrison winning. He claimed that he never met Harrison, and that he doubted that Harrison even knew who he was. But I doubt that. But it was really a fun newspaper and highly successful for the Log Cabin campaign.
Where did you find these newspapers?
Well, in the old days, you couldn't find them. When I first looked into this, I was in Washington, D.C., so I went over to the Library of Congress. You get a research card, and if you want to see the log cabin newspaper, okay, we'll make an appointment. You come in, we send somebody back. They bring out this old newspaper that's falling apart.
Oh, it's the actual paper.
The actual paper. You have to put rubber gloves on if you want to read it, and you can barely turn the page. So you can imagine researching and taking notes for a whole year of the log cabins. I forget it. When I started doing the book again, I was in Williamsburg, Virginia, right near where Harrison and Tyler were born. And by now, the log cabin is digitized. So I went over to the library at the College of William and Mary, pushed a button, there it was, every edition. And I could just easily take notes. So the digital age made a huge difference in researching this book.
Now, why would Horace Greeley have supported William Henry Harrison?
He was a very liberal man. He was actually anti-slavery. Harrison really didn't say where he was, but he had owned slaves at one point. But he supported the ideas because he believed government should help people who are out of work. So he printed a lot of stories about poor people looking for work, and then printed Van Buren's harsh responses to these kind of people. So it was pretty much within his own philosophy, and of course he later went on to start the New York Herald Tribune. Van
Buren was a slave owner?
No, Harrison was at one point.
But Van Buren was not?
He actually did have, I was surprised.
Even though he was in New York.
Did have a slave. His mother had inherited some slaves, and they lived in upstate New York. At that time, some farmers did have slaves. They used slaves at their tavern also. And then when Van Buren won the election to the U.S. Senate, the state Senate, and he moved to Albany, and I found that he had a personal slave named Tom that went with him. So I was surprised that he had one. Tom used the occasion to run away. Van Buren didn't really go look for him, but when he turned up later in Richmond, he said, if you can catch him without violence, well, I'll sell him to you. I don't know what happened to him, but yeah, I was surprised to see that he actually did have a slave, although he wasn't particularly pro-slavery, but he believed that it was up to the states to change the law, and the federal government couldn't do it.
Was slavery an issue in the campaign?
It was kind of an under-issue. It was always there because the abolitionists had started campaigning against it, and they finally started their own party called the Liberty Party. But even some of the Liberty Party people said that it was hard to compete against the Harrison log cabin and hard cider campaign because it just was so enthusiastic, and people got caught up in enthusiasm. Plus, Harrison was kind of murky about how he felt. When he left home, he had joined a Quaker humane society that was anti-slavery, which apparently upset his father, which is why he went off to study medicine. But on the campaign trail, of course, he never said much about anything, but he kind of hinted to the abolitionists that he was against it, but then the southern states, he kind of hinted that he was for slavery. So it was never very clear, but he did have some slaves at one point that he had inherited from his mother.
Now, John Tyler, Harrison's running mate, was a slave owner.
Tyler definitely was a slave owner. He lived in Williamsburg, Virginia, and he was a states' rights man. He believed that the federal government should never, ever interfere with the rights of the states, including the slavery issue. So he actually, when he became president, he brought some of his slaves to work in the White House.
And he later became a member of the Confederate Congress. During the Civil War.
After he left the White House, his states' rights views were so strong that he sided with the Confederacy. He had moved back near Williamsburg. He had moved into a big house, which he named Sherwood Forest, which seems kind of odd. I know when I first drove by, I said, that's an odd name for John Tyler's house. But when he became president, he pretty much didn't follow any of the Whig policies, so they kicked him out of the party. So he didn't have a party. So since he was considered an outlaw by his party, like Robin Hood, he named his retirement home Sherwood Forest. So anyway, just before the Civil War, he actually joined a group in Washington to try to find a solution to head off the war, but that didn't work out, obviously. So he joined the Congress, the Confederate Congress. But when he went to the first meeting, he hadn't been sworn in yet. He was staying in Richmond, and that's when he got sick and died.
You say in your book that young Abraham Lincoln was a supporter of William Henry Harrison.
He was. He was. That was really fun to come across Lincoln. He was an elector for Harrison, so if Harrison won, he would cast one of the electoral votes. And he was a big advocate of Lincoln. He would give speeches all around from the back of wagons, and he did the first Stephen Douglas debate speeches at the time because Douglas was a Democrat.
So there were Lincoln-Douglas debates about the 1840 election, and then again in 1858 when they ran for Senate, and then they ran against each other for president.
Exactly. So they knew each other well. They were both from Springfield, Illinois, and so they would go around. I remember one anecdote in the book where Lincoln was saying all these negative things about Van Buren, and Douglas said, well, that's not true. Where do you get those ideas? And Lincoln holds up this book, this biography of Van Buren. He said, well, from this book, and Douglas grabs the books and throws it in the audience and says, damn such a book. So Abe did all right on that one.
Was that the Davy Crockett book?
No. Well, I don't know what it was, but there were a lot of biographies of both Harrison and Van Buren. I was surprised how many there were at the time.
Where did you find the Davy Crockett book?
The Davy Crockett book was pretty famous back then, but again, you can get it online. If you go online, you can actually read the Davy Crockett book. And he wasn't around for the 1840 campaign because he had gone to the Alamo, which you remember did not work out well for him. So he wasn't able to get out the campaign, but they certainly used his images during the campaign.
What was, back in Washington, President Van Buren, how was he campaigning?
He was sitting there. He didn't do anything. The way you campaigned in those days was you would answer letters from voters. And the letters your responses would get printed in the paper, or you would send people out to speak. He sent his vice president out. Richard Mentor Johnson was the president. Vice president. He actually was the man who was with Harrison at the Battle of the Thames, and he was the man that was believed to have killed Tecumseh. He never said he actually did. He had been badly injured, shot many times during that battle, and he became the vice president. He never said he did it, but his campaign slogan was Rumpsy Dumpsy, Johnson killed Tecumseh. So it's pretty much said he did. So he goes out. He wasn't even their nominee, though, because he was too controversial. He owned a plantation in Kentucky, and he had lived with an African-American woman and had several children. She died, and he started living with another African-American woman. So they didn't nominate him at the convention. Once again, they just said, here are 4 guys, pick from these guys, and he was one of them, but they did not nominate him. The other 3 pretty much dropped out, so he was actually the nominee, and he campaigned a lot, and he tried to get Van Buren to do it, but Van Buren didn't think that was proper for a president. So he sort of started what we now know as kind of the Rose Garden strategy, where the president just stays there, acts presidential, and hopes that will win him votes from the voters.
And you say in your book that William Henry Harrison gave the first ever campaign speech by a candidate?
Yes. As I said, it was considered highly improper to campaign. So conceited for you to do that. And Harrison abided by this. He stayed in his home and he wrote some letters. But meanwhile, they're out there calling him grannies. They said he was a coward in the war. And then finally, a voter in New York had written Harrison a letter, and he gets a letter back, and it finds out it's not from Harrison at all. It's from his campaign committee. So this becomes a huge scandal. It's like something that this president has been lying to us. He's not really answering his letters. So the Democrat newspapers, he's being kept in an iron cage. He's General Mum. He won't say anything. Well, this was just too much for Harrison. So he gets this invitation to go speak at an anniversary of one of his battles up in northern Ohio, Fort Meigs. So he said, by golly, he's going to go. And, this shook up his advisors because they don't want him saying anything.
Oh, it was his decision.
His decision, and they couldn't stop him. But we go back to the log cabin and hard cider theme. So instead of packing his silk hat that he normally would wear, he takes his farmer's hat, He takes his plain clothes, and he starts off on his trip, which is a long way. He's way down in southern Ohio. They're going northern Ohio. Gets on a stagecoach. The Whigs spread the word that he's traveling, and the big crowds come out. And he's the first candidate. He has to shake hands with people. And his hand got so sore, he put a glove on it the time he got to Columbus, which is in the middle of the state. So he gets to Columbus. He goes over to the Tippecanoe cabin. They had put Tippecanoe cabins in every city. And he sees people there, and he goes to the hotel right in the middle of town. So he's leaving the next morning, and there's a crowd outside. So he starts talking to him a little bit, and pretty soon he was giving a speech. The very first speech was in June of 1840. He gives this full speech answering his critics, saying he's not kept in an iron cage, and that he does hint that he lives in a log cabin. And they love it. So he goes on to this other speech in Fort Meigs, and there's a crowd there of, I don't know, like 20,000 people. And he gives this major speech, and he's liking this. So he starts giving speeches on his way back to his home in Ohio, and he ended up giving more than 24 speeches. Some of these speeches drew over 100,000 people. I mean, 100,000 people in 1840. The entire country was like the size of New York State.
How would they have heard him?
That's a good question. A lot of them probably did not hear him. But apparently you could hear him pretty good because this was so unusual. The crowds were like quiet. I mean, you could hear a pin drop because they had never seen a presidential candidate speak before, and people would come from miles around. They had 100,000 people in Dayton, and Dayton was like 3,000 people population. But they came from all over the country. People rode on horseback, by wagon, just to see this. And they could see that he was not the young man that they had pictured, but he was still kind of lively, and he would ride up to the speaker's stand on his white horse, Whitey. And so he was still pretty exciting to see, especially since nobody had ever seen this before. And so this is how he made history, and of course, that history is last. You couldn't imagine a campaign today without the candidate speaking.
Well, I want to ask about that because the subtitle of your book talked about how the campaign changed presidential elections forever. From that point on, were campaigns like that, or did future campaigns relapse to the old way of doing it?
Both. It took a while for that to catch on in terms of the speaker, the candidate going out to speak, but eventually, when Lincoln ran, Lincoln was a great speaker. He didn't go speaking when he ran, but his opponent Douglas did. Douglas went to every state in the country speaking, and then Horace Greeley ran for president 4 years later against Grant, and he took the first whistle-stop train trip across the country, which wasn't that big at the time, and they would every stop, and sometimes it would be like a minute because they would just stop to get some water, and he'd be on the back of the train giving a speech, and then whisk, it was gone, you know. But and he lost. But so eventually that did become the norm. They did almost immediately go to the grassroots rallies and parades and other changes. One of the ones we probably want to talk about is how women got involved in this.
Yeah, you talk about how they talked to women's groups, campaigned to women's groups. And why would they do that? Because women weren't allowed to vote.
Women were not allowed to vote. In fact, like the speaking, it was considered highly improper for women to even become involved in politics. You know, they were too tender for that, and just too rough for the women. Well, the Whigs decided that the women could help them win. They couldn't vote, but they could persuade their husbands to vote, and they could persuade their boyfriends to vote. So they handed out things like at rallies you'd see women waving handkerchiefs from the side. And this was not by accident because the advance men went around giving out free handkerchiefs to the ladies at these rallies. And the newspapers would write about all the women waving their handkerchiefs. And in Baltimore, one woman waved a red petticoat from a window. And young women, the single women, started wearing these little things across the top saying Whig men or none. And they made their boyfriends vow to vote Whig or they would stop seeing them. And wives tried to persuade their husbands to vote. And actually one Whig woman who didn't have to be persuaded was Mary Todd in Illinois. She had moved there with her sister at the time Abraham Lincoln was campaigning for Harrison. And actually Lincoln was working with her brother-in-law. So she met Lincoln at a Whig party. But she was already a big Whig supporter. And then, of course, they ended up getting married.
Did you come across a lot of memorabilia from the campaign? I mean, campaign buttons and sashes and things like that?
I didn't personally, but it was an incredible number of, and again, this was part of their strategy. We've often heard of selling presidential candidates like soap, but there really was a Tippecanoe shaving soap. There were plates with log cabins pictures on it. There were snuff boxes with Harrison's pictures on it. There were pitchers with Harrison's pictures on it. Anything, shaving, razors, everything. And they were all Harrison, or they were log cabin. They had posters depicting General Harrison and his great victories. There were cartoons against Van Buren. Some beautiful drawings of supposedly Harrison, again as a nice young man, by a guy named Currier, who later joined with a guy named Ives to become Currier and Ives. But these beautiful color like lithographs showing young William Henry Harrison as a dashing leader, as a general, as just a handsome man. So marketing, again, it all began in this campaign, and of course it has never stopped.
And it was only the Whigs who were doing this during this campaign, or were the Democrats doing anything like this?
When the Whigs did this kind of thing, the Democrats tried to copy them, but they weren't very good at it. There were some Van Buren buttons and handkerchiefs, but not very many. And there were some anti-Harrison cartoons, but it seemed like most of the cartoonists were Whigs because they were anti-Van Buren. So for the most part, the Democrats pretty much stuck to the old script, much to their chagrin.
You quote some of the campaign songs in there. How prominent were the campaign songs?
These were incredible. This was a song. This was a campaign that was put to song. Because it helped raise the entertainment value of the rallies. In the very first one in Columbus, Ohio, there was the people in Marysville, Ohio, just north of Columbus, built their log cabin on wheels. They pulled by horses to Columbus, and a local man wrote a song called the Log Cabin Song about the Buckeye tree, because they built them from the Buckeye tree. And they not only sang the song, but they had printing presses on the wagons, and they would print up copies of these songs and hand them out to the crowd, and they would start singing. And pretty soon this was across the country. The biggest one actually again took place in Columbus. One of the big things in the parade was this big rolling ball, about 10 feet high or 15 feet high in some cases, and they would roll it down the street and from town to town, and had pro-Harrison sayings on it. That was started the phrase, "Keep the ball rolling." So this young jeweler from a town nearby saw this. He was so excited, and he belonged to the Tippecanoe Glee Club back in his hometown of Zanesville. So he went home and he wrote this song, The Great Commotion, about keeping the ball rolling, and the chorus was "For Tippecanoe and Tyler too." And obviously that caught on. It was a chorus to a song and became the most famous slogan in history for a presidential campaign. And it was just one of hundreds, and probably thousands of songs. Most of them were written to popular songs like the national anthem or Old Lang Syne, and just new words to it. But it was just part of the whole campaign that you would have, even like they would hire singers to jump into stagecoaches and sing these songs as the stagecoach was going along like a traveling commercial. So it was an intricate part of the campaign.
How long was the campaign going hot and heavy? We're used to it now going a year and a half or 2 years. How long were they actively campaigning?
Well, Harrison was nominated in December. Van Buren actually wasn't renominated until May. The campaign probably started with that rally in Columbus in February. It was Washington's birthday, February 22nd, 1840. So I would pin it to the start in February, which used to be sort of the typical campaign from February to November, so yeah, I would say from February to November at that time.
Election day was November, beginning of November, like it is now?
Well, there wasn't one election day. There were a bunch of election days, and they were around that time. And the states would vote first, and they would elect people, and then the federal elections would take place. So around that time, from late October to like November 10th were the elections.
How did people vote?
They voted any way they wanted to, even if it wasn't legal.
You write in the book about voter intimidation.
Yeah, well, in those days, almost anything went in terms of getting people to vote or getting them not to vote. So some of the parties would send out these bullies to the polls. And matter of fact, sitting in Harrisburg here, there was another editor of another Harrisburg newspaper who went to vote, and he got beat up. He nearly got his ear torn off by these guys because they knew he was going to vote for the Whigs. In Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln was told that there was some bully in front of the polls stopping people from voting. So he went over there, and Lincoln was a pretty big guy, about 6'4". So he persuaded the man to leave, and he later lamented that he didn't get in the fight because he wanted to beat him up.
So election day, well, you have the results in here, a chart showing all the states' popular vote and electoral vote. And from this, I learned that Pennsylvania went for Harrison over Van Buren by 351 votes out of about 300,000 cast.
It was very close in Pennsylvania. And again, it was hard to know what was going on in the day. I have a story in there about a man, when he was a young boy, was sent out to get all the papers in Pennsylvania. He lived in Pennsylvania, and he got the papers, and the Whig papers said that Harrison had won by 1,000 votes. But the Democratic papers said that, no, Van Buren had won by 1,000 votes. So they didn't really know until several days later, and it turned out to be very close. And Pennsylvania was a big state, and Harrison pulled it out. However, it's interesting to note that despite Lincoln's efforts in Illinois, Illinois went for Van Buren. And
you also say under here, South Carolina, no popular vote.
No, they didn't believe in trusting the voters to this task. So they were the last one where the state legislature decided who got their electoral votes.
So Van Buren or Harrison won pretty handily. But was his win regional? Was it mostly one section or the other of the states?
Well, he won by a wide margin in the Electoral College. The popular vote was a lot closer. And some people speculate that there was some backlash to this kind of carnival atmosphere of his campaign. But he won a lot of the big states. He won in the North. He lost Virginia, even though he and Tyler both were originally from there. So he mainly did his best in the North. He didn't do as well in the South. But his electoral vote was runaway.
Did he show any signs of ill health prior to becoming president?
He claims not. He seemed to, anytime he wrote somebody, he seemed to add a P.S., I'm in very good health. And when he got to Washington, his health, it wasn't that his physical health was that bad, but the campaign was long and enduring. Plus, he campaigned. No other president had done that. And it wasn't easy. I mean, you're riding stagecoaches, you're going over bumpy, you didn't have expressways. You had bumpy roads you were going over. And then he had to go from Ohio all the way to Washington, took steamboats, took bumpy rides, finally took a train into Washington, arriving on his 68th birthday. So he's tired when he gets there. Plus, in those days, when you won the presidency, everybody wanted a job, and especially this year when everybody was out of work. So even back in Ohio, the job seekers started pounding on his door. He gets to Washington, you're not even safe in the White House, because back then, anybody could walk into the White House. So he'd go into a room, and there'd be all these job seekers sitting there. And he said, he wrote people, said basically he didn't have time to go to the bathroom because he had all these people wanting jobs. So it was a very wearing, in addition to taking on the challenges of the presidency.
So right now the president is inaugurated January 20th, but in Harrison's case it was March.
It used to be back
4th?
in March,
Mm-hmm.
March 4th.
First ever inaugural parade.
Yes. He goes there and they're going to have the inauguration. So they go from the White House, well, he was staying at a hotel, and he goes up to Capitol Hill. So they decide to do just like his campaign. They have a big parade. They have the log cabins on wheels. They had a new carriage for him to ride in. He said no, he didn't want to ride in it. He's going to ride his horse, Old Whitey, down Pennsylvania Avenue. It was a cold and windy day, but he didn't wear a hat or coat. And He did have a hat on as he rode his horse, but he kept doffing it as he went up the road. So he had a parade up to the Capitol, and the crowd was the biggest in history. It was just, the place was inundated, waiting for this president to come out in this really cold, blustery day. And he comes out for his speech. He's not wearing a hat or coat or anything. It's freezing. And he gives the longest inaugural speech in history, 1 hour and 45 minutes. And I read it, and I can tell you it's probably the most boring inaugural speech in history. But he goes on and on. And interesting, he wasn't actually sworn in until his very last sentence. He gave his speech. The Chief Justice was sitting next to him, and he gets to his last sentence. He stops. Chief Justice comes up and gives him the oath of office. And then he closes. And then they have another parade back down to the White House.
Now, you gave away the ending at the beginning that he died very shortly after taking office, but sort of the thing you hear about him is not only that he was Tippecanoe, but that he caught a cold during his inaugural address and died. But in your book, you say he was taking brisk walks
exactly.
after he
that
was
is the legend. That first of all, but a lot of the stories say it was raining during that day. It wasn't raining, but it was very cold. But he was fine. He went to 3 inaugural balls that night. So he moves into the White House, and every morning he goes out for a walk. He goes out to the market. You know, the President of the United States is walking down. He had no Secret Service or anything like that. And he walks down the street, and one day he had just gotten a haircut in the White House, and he goes out and gets caught in a rainstorm. Again, it was February, but he didn't have, it was, actually it would be March, right? It would be March. He didn't have his hat and coat on. And he got caught in the rain. He went back, and he didn't change his clothes. So he come down with a cold, and he calls the doctor, and then he seems okay. He didn't go to bed. And then the next night, at 4 in the morning, he's feeling pretty bad, and the doctor comes in.
Did the doctors kill him?
There is some speculation to that point. In those days, the popular methods were not exactly what we would do today. So he gets worse and worse. They tried to bleed him, which was the thing which probably killed George Washington. But he's so old and frail, they decided not to do that. So they do everything. They blister him. They put these hot cups on him and try to get the blood flowing. And they give him all kinds of enemas, and they give him all kinds of medicines, and pretty much beat up his old body. And he finally passed away after only 31 days in office.
I wish we could keep talking because there's so much more about this we could talk about, but we're out of time. We've been speaking with Ronald Shafer. He is the author of this book, The Carnival Campaign, How the Rollicking 1840 Campaign of Tippecanoe and Tyler II Changed Presidential Elections Forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I loved it.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.